The rain drummed against the funeral home windows as I stood in the back corner of the viewing room, watching my own memorial service unfold before me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was very much alive, hidden behind a massive floral arrangement, listening to people discuss my supposed death with a mixture of relief and manufactured grief that made my stomach turn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It had been 3 days since the car accident that everyone believed had claimed my life. 3 days since I'd been thrown from the vehicle and landed in a ravine, unconscious but breathing. 3 days since a homeless man named Pete had found me, brought me to his makeshift shelter, and nursed me back to consciousness without involving hospitals or authorities. 3 days since the world had declared Margaret Chen dead at 58 years old. But I wasn't dead. I was very much alive, and I was about to discover truths about my family that would make me wish I actually had perished in that twisted, metal wreckage. The viewing room was filled with faces I recognized, though many looked more relieved than bereaved. My 3 children stood near the closed casket, playing their roles as grieving offspring with Oscar-worthy performances. There was Michael, my eldest at 35, his face a mask of solemn duty as he shook hands with visitors and accepted condolences. Sarah, my middle child at 32, dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue while speaking in hushed tones about what a wonderful mother I had been. And then there was Daniel, my baby at 28, standing slightly apart from his siblings with an expression I couldn't quite read. I had arrived at the funeral home through the back entrance, my appearance drastically altered by the accident and my 3 days of rough living. My usually pristine silver hair was now tangled and dirty, my face bruised and swollen, and I wore clothes Pete had found for me, an oversized jacket and ill-fitting pants that made me look like a completely different person. The funeral director had been kind enough to let me in when I'd spun a story about being a distant relative who had traveled far to pay respects. He hadn't looked too closely, focused as he was on managing the steady stream of visitors. From my vantage point behind the towering arrangement of white lilies, I could see everything while remaining invisible. It was surreal, watching people mourn someone who was standing mere feet away, listening to conversations about my life as if I were truly gone. What struck me most was how many of the visitors seemed to be there more out of obligation than genuine sorrow. Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street was there, looking uncomfortable in her black dress as she whispered to her husband about how they'd always found me difficult to deal with. My former colleagues from the accounting firm where I'd worked for 23 years clustered near the guest book. Their conversations focused more on office gossip than memories of our time together. Even my sister Linda, who lived 2 states away, seemed more interested in checking her phone than engaging with the other mourners. But it was my children's behavior that truly captured my attention. As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, I watched them interact with each other in ways that revealed a dynamic I'd never noticed while I was supposedly alive and present in their lives. Michael, ever the responsible eldest child, was clearly coordinating something with his siblings. I watched him lean close to Sarah, whispering instructions about paperwork and timelines. Sarah nodded along, her grief-stricken facade slipping, occasionally to reveal something that looked remarkably like anticipation. Daniel remained quiet, but I noticed his eyes constantly scanning the room, as if he were waiting for something or someone. It was then that I overheard the conversation that would change everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my children. The viewing was winding down, and most of the visitors had offered their condolences and departed. Only a handful of people remained, including my children and a few close family friends. I was preparing to leave myself, having heard enough empty platitudes and witnessed enough artificial mourning to last a lifetime, when I heard Michael's voice carry across the room. He was standing with Sarah and Daniel near the casket, their heads bent together in what appeared to be an intimate family moment. From my position behind the flowers, I could hear every word clearly. "Well, Michael said, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard from him before. She's finally gone. The words hit me like a physical blow. There was no sadness in his voice, no grief or loss. If anything, he sounded relieved, satisfied even. Sarah's response made my blood run cold. I know we shouldn't be talking about this here, but I have to admit, I'm glad it's over. The constant phone calls, the demands for attention, the way she always made everything about herself. I was getting exhausted trying to manage her. Daniel, my youngest, the child I'd thought understood me best, nodded in agreement. She was becoming such a burden. Remember how she kept insisting on being involved in every decision we made? Like we were still children who needed her permission for everything. I gripped the edge of a nearby chair to steady myself, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. These were my children, the people I'd devoted my entire adult life to, raising, supporting, and loving unconditionally. And they were discussing my death like it was the resolution to a long-standing problem. Michael continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his theme. The timing is actually perfect, you know. With the insurance money and the house sale, we can finally move forward with our plans without having to worry about her reaction or interference. Insurance money? House sale? What were they talking about? I'd had a modest life insurance policy, certainly, but nothing substantial. And why would they be selling the house I'd lived in for 30 years? The house that held all our family memories? Sarah glanced around nervously before responding. Are you sure we can pull this off? The paperwork is going to be complicated and we need to make sure everything looks legitimate. I've already spoken with Dad's old lawyer, Michael replied, and I felt another shock run through me. Dad's old lawyer? My late husband Thomas had died 8 years ago. Why would they be consulting with his attorney about my affairs? Daniel finally spoke up, his voice quieter than his siblings but no less determined. What about the neighbors? Mom was pretty well known in the community. People are going to ask questions if we start making major changes too quickly. That's why we wait a respectful amount of time, Michael explained patiently. 6 months, maybe 8, long enough for people to move on and stop paying attention. Then we can do whatever we want with the property and the money. The casual way they discussed manipulating the timeline of their mourning period, calculating how long they needed to maintain their grieving act before they could claim their rewards, made me feel physically ill. These weren't the children I'd raised. Or perhaps they were exactly the children I'd raised, and I'd been too blind to see it. Sarah pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what looked like a real estate app. I've already been looking at condos downtown. With my share of the money, I can finally get that place in the arts district I've always wanted. No more pretending to care about suburban life just to make Mom happy. And I can expand the restaurant without having to worry about her opinions on every decision, Daniel added. She never understood the business anyway, but she always acted like she knew better than everyone else. Michael nodded approvingly at his siblings' plans. Exactly. We can all finally live our own lives without having to constantly manage her emotions and expectations. I wanted to storm out from behind the flowers and confront them immediately, to demand an explanation for their heartless words and calculations. But something held me back. Perhaps it was shock, or maybe it was a growing realization that I needed to understand the full scope of what they were planning before I revealed myself. As I stood there, invisible and forgotten, more pieces of their conversation began to paint a picture that horrified me. They spoke about my life as if it had been an inconvenience to them, a series of obligations they'd been forced to fulfill, out of duty rather than love. They discussed my phone calls as interruptions, my desire to spend time with them as neediness, and my interest in their lives as interference. But most disturbing of all was the way they talked about my death as an opportunity rather than a loss. They had plans, elaborate plans for what they would do with the freedom and resources my absence would provide them. Plans that suggested they'd been thinking about this scenario for far longer than the 3 days since my supposed death. The funeral director approached them then, interrupting their private conversation to discuss arrangements for the next day's service. I used the distraction to slip out through the back door, my mind reeling with everything I'd heard. Outside, in the parking lot, the rain had intensified, soaking through Pete's borrowed clothes and chilling me to the bone. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional devastation I was experiencing. In the span of 20 minutes, I'd learned that my children viewed my death as a liberation and had already begun planning how to profit from my absence. I walked aimlessly through the empty streets, trying to process what I'd discovered. How long had they felt this way about me? How many conversations had they had about what they would do when I was gone? How many family gatherings had been endured rather than enjoyed? How many expressions of love had been performed rather than felt? The rain continued to fall as I made my way back to Pete's makeshift camp under the highway overpass. He was there, tending a small fire in a metal drum, and he looked up with concern when he saw my condition. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, then paused and shook his head. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sorry, poor choice of words considering everyone thinks you are one. Pete was probably in his 60s, with weathered features and kind eyes that had seen too much of life's hardships. He'd found me in that ravine 3 days ago, unconscious, and bleeding, and had made the decision to help me without asking questions or expecting anything in return. In 3 days, this homeless stranger had shown me more genuine care and concern than my own children had apparently felt in years. "I went to my funeral," I told him, settling down on an upturned crate near the fire. "I heard things I wish I could unhear." Pete poured hot coffee from a battered thermos into a paper cup and handed it to me. "Family?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice to remain steady if I tried to speak. "Family can be the hardest thing to face," he said, quietly. "They know exactly where to hit to cause the most damage because they helped create those vulnerable spots in the first place." "They were relieved," I whispered, the words coming out in a rush. Not sad, not grieving, not missing me. Relieved that I was gone. "They have plans, Pete. Plans for my money, my house, my life insurance. They've been waiting for me to die." Pete stirred the fire with a long stick, sending sparks dancing up into the rainy night. "What are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air between us. What was I going to do? I could reveal myself, confront them directly, and demand explanations. But then what? Go back to being the burdensome mother they clearly saw me as? Resume the relationships that had apparently been sources of obligation and irritation for them? Or I could stay dead, at least for a while, and see exactly what they were planning to do. I could discover the full extent of their deception and manipulation. I could learn who my children really were when they thought no one was watching. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't go back to the way things were. Not after hearing what I heard tonight." Pete nodded knowingly. Sometimes the universe gives us a gift we didn't know we needed, a chance to see the truth, even when it hurts. As I sat there in the flickering light of the fire, surrounded by the sounds of the city and the steady drum of rain, I began to formulate a plan. If my children wanted me to be dead, then dead I would remain. At least long enough to discover what they were really capable of and to figure out how to reclaim the life they were so eager to redistribute among themselves. But first, I needed to understand more about what they were planning. I needed to know about this insurance money they'd mentioned, about the house sale, about the lawyer they'd consulted. I needed to piece together how long they'd been preparing for my death and what steps they were taking to profit from it. The next morning, I made my way back to my neighborhood, taking care to avoid the areas where I might be recognized. My House sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees, a modest two-story colonial that Thomas and I had bought when Michael was just a baby. We'd poured our hearts and savings into making it a home, creating spaces where our children could grow and thrive. Now, looking at it from across the street, I felt like I was viewing a piece of property rather than the repository of 30 years of family memories. Several cars were parked in the driveway, and I could see people moving around inside through the windows. My children, presumably, along with others I couldn't identify from this distance. I spent the day observing the house, noting who came and went, trying to understand what kind of activities were taking place inside. There were several official-looking visitors, people in suits carrying briefcases who stayed for extended periods. At one point, a man with a camera spent an hour photographing the exterior and interior of the house, suggesting that Sarah's comment about real estate wasn't idle speculation. As the day wore on, I began to see a pattern emerging. This wasn't the frantic activity of grief-stricken children trying to manage their deceased mother's affairs. This was the organized efficiency of people executing a carefully planned strategy. That evening, I returned to Pete's camp with a new understanding of my situation. My children hadn't simply been relieved by my death. They had been prepared for it. The speed with which they were moving, the coordination of their efforts, the apparent involvement of legal and real estate professionals, none of this could have been arranged in the 3 days since my accident. "They've been planning this," I told Pete as we shared another meal of canned soup heated over his fire. "Maybe not my specific death, but what they would do when I died. They've been ready." Pete looked at me with sympathy. "How does that make you feel?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. I felt betrayed, certainly, hurt and angry and confused. But underneath all of those emotions was something else, something I was only beginning to recognize. A strange sense of freedom. For the first time in decades, I had no obligations to anyone. No one was expecting me to call or visit or remember birthdays or anniversaries or maintain the emotional labor of family relationships. No one was judging my choices or questioning my decisions or making me feel guilty for not being the mother they wanted me to be. I was completely, utterly alone in the world, and it was both terrifying and liberating. "I feel like I've been given a chance to start over," I said slowly. "To figure out who Margaret Chen is when she's not trying to be the perfect mother or the dutiful widow or the reliable neighbor." Pete smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "That's a gift, you know. Most people never get to find out who they really are underneath all the roles they play." As the fire burned down and the city settled into its nighttime rhythm around us, I began to think about what came next. I couldn't stay hidden forever, living off Pete's kindness and the charity of strangers. Eventually, I would need to reclaim my life, my identity, my assets. But not yet. First, I wanted to see exactly what my children were capable of. I wanted to understand the full scope of their plans and the depth of their deception. I wanted to know if there was anything salvageable in our relationships or if the love I'd felt for them had been entirely one-sided. And I wanted to figure out who I was going to be when I finally rose from the dead. The funeral service was scheduled for the next afternoon, and I knew I had to be there. Not just to witness the final act of my children's performance, but to see who else showed up to mourn Margaret Chen. I needed to understand how my life had looked to others, what impression I'd made on the world, what legacy I was supposedly leaving behind. But more than that, I needed to hear what my children would say about me when they thought it was their final opportunity to define my memory. Would they speak truthfully about our relationship? Or would they craft a narrative that served their purposes? Would they honor the woman who had raised them, or would they bury her along with the inconvenient truth of their feelings? As I prepared for sleep on Pete's makeshift bed of cardboard and blankets, I realized that tomorrow would determine not just how Margaret Chen would be remembered, but how she would choose to live the rest of her life. The woman who walked into that church would not be the same woman who had climbed out of that ravine 3 days ago. She would be someone who had heard the truth about herself, who had seen behind the masks her children wore, who had been forced to confront the reality of relationships she'd believed were built on love, but were apparently founded on obligation and endurance. Tomorrow, Margaret Chen would attend her own funeral, and depending on what she learned there, she might just decide to stay dead a little while longer. The funeral service began at 2 o'clock on a gray Thursday afternoon, and I arrived early to secure a position in the back pew where I could observe without being noticed. The church was the same one where Thomas and I had been married 32 years ago, where each of our children had been baptized, where we had celebrated countless Christmas and Easter services as a family. Now it would serve as the stage for the final act of their elaborate deception. I had spent the morning with Pete, who had helped me refine my disguise. Using makeup he'd somehow procured from sources I didn't ask about, we had darkened the bruises on my face to look like natural aging, styled my tangled hair to appear deliberately unkempt rather than accidentally so, and found me a black dress. That fit well enough to look intentional. With a pair of reading glasses Pete had found at a thrift store and a walking cane he'd fashioned from a sturdy branch, I looked like an elderly woman who might have known Margaret Chen in passing, but wouldn't draw particular attention. The transformation was remarkable. Even I barely recognized myself in the cracked mirror Pete kept in his camp. The Margaret Chen who had driven off that bridge 3 days ago was well-groomed, carefully dressed, concerned with appearances and propriety. This woman was weathered, worn, invisible in the way that society often renders older women invisible. It was the perfect camouflage for what I needed to do. As mourners began filing into the church, I was struck by how many people had come to pay their respects. The pews filled steadily with faces I recognized and many I didn't. Former colleagues, from the accounting firm, neighbors from the street where I'd lived for decades, members of the book club I'd belonged to for 15 years, parents of children I'd helped with math tutoring over the years. There were people I hadn't seen in months, others I'd spoken to just days before my accident. Watching them take their seats, seeing the genuine sadness on many of their faces, I began to realize that perhaps my impact on the world had been greater than my children's dismissive words had suggested. These people had made time in their lives to honor my memory, to sit in uncomfortable pews and listen to prayers and eulogies for a woman they had known and apparently valued. Mrs. Patterson, my next-door neighbor for 23 years, was crying openly as she spoke with other members of our neighborhood. Jim Rodriguez, whose taxes I'd helped prepare every year for the past decade, kept shaking his head in disbelief as he told whoever would listen about how I'd saved him thousands of dollars and countless headaches. 3 former students I'd tutored, now adults with children of their own, sat together in the middle section, their presence a testament to connections that had lasted far beyond our original interactions. But it was the people I didn't immediately recognize who surprised me most. An elderly black woman I'd never seen before sat in the front section, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. A young Hispanic man in a military uniform stood at attention near the side wall, his face solemn with respect. A middle-aged Asian woman with 2 teenage children kept glancing toward the closed casket with an expression of profound gratitude. Who were these people? What role had I played in their lives that would bring them here today to mourn my passing? The realization that there were entire chapters of my impact on the world that I'd forgotten or undervalued began to shift something fundamental in my understanding of my own worth. My children, meanwhile, sat in the front pew like a receiving line of professional mourners. Michael wore an expensive black suit and maintained the somber expression of a dutiful son bearing the weight of family responsibility. Sarah had chosen an elegant dress that managed to convey both grief and sophistication, her makeup perfectly applied to suggest tears without actually ruining her appearance. Daniel sat slightly apart from his siblings, his body language suggesting a discomfort that went beyond normal grief. As the service began, I found myself studying these three people I'd devoted my life to raising and trying to reconcile them with the children I thought I knew. The Michael sitting in that front pew bore little resemblance to the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who had cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart, who had called me every Sunday during his first year of college because he was homesick. Where was that vulnerable, loving child in this composed man who had spoken of my death as a relief? Sarah, too, seemed like a stranger wearing my daughter's face. This polished woman accepting condolences with practiced grace was nothing like the teenager who had spent hours with me planning her prom dress, who had sobbed in my kitchen when she didn't get into her first-choice college, who had asked me to be her maid of honor because she couldn't imagine getting married without me by her side. When had that open, emotional girl transformed into this calculating woman who viewed my love as a burden? And Daniel, my youngest, my baby, who had been premature and tiny and had required so much extra care in his early months. I had spent countless nights walking the floors with him, singing lullabies and telling him stories, bonding with him in ways that had made him seem like an extension of my own heart. The young man in that pew, fidgeting with discomfort at his own mother's funeral, bore no resemblance to the child who had once told me I was his best friend in the whole world. The pastor, Reverend Williams, had known our family for over 20 years. He had officiated at Thomas's funeral, had counseled me through the darkest period of my widowhood, had watched my children grow from adolescents into adults. His eulogy began with standard platitudes about Margaret Chen being a devoted wife and mother, a contributing member of the community, a woman of faith and integrity. But as he continued speaking, his words began to reveal a version of my life that I had somehow lost sight of along the way. He spoke about my volunteer work at the Literacy Center, reading to children whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't be there for story time. He mentioned my years of service organizing the annual clothing drive for the homeless shelter, coordinating donations and distribution with quiet efficiency. He talked about my reputation as the neighbor people turn to in times of crisis, the woman who showed up with casseroles during illnesses and offered practical help during family emergencies. As I listened to Reverend Williams enumerate the ways I had touched lives and contributed to my community, I began to understand that my children's dismissive attitude toward my life said more about them than it did about me. They had reduced me to the role of burdensome mother because that was the only relationship with me they had chosen to acknowledge. But I had been, and was, so much more than their mother. The first speaker after the Reverend's eulogy was someone I didn't immediately recognize, the elderly black woman I'd noticed earlier. She approached the podium slowly, using a walker, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through significant struggles and emerged with wisdom intact. Her name was Dorothy Washington, and she told a story I had completely forgotten. 5 years ago, her grandson had been arrested for a crime he didn't commit. The family had no money for a good lawyer, no connections in the legal system, no idea how to navigate the complex bureaucracy that was determining the young man's future. Dorothy had mentioned the situation to me during a chance encounter at the grocery store, and I had spent the next 6 weeks making phone calls, researching legal aid options, and eventually connecting them with a pro bono attorney who specialized in cases like theirs. The charges were eventually dropped, Dorothy told the congregation, and her grandson was now a college graduate working as a social worker, dedicated to helping other young people avoid the traps that had nearly destroyed his life. She had come to the funeral, she said, because Margaret Chen had saved her family, and she wanted my children to know what kind of woman their mother had been. I watched my children's faces as Dorothy spoke, saw the surprise and confusion there. They had known nothing about this situation, nothing about the hours I'd spent researching legal precedents and making phone calls to lawyers and advocacy groups. To them, I had simply been their mother who sometimes seemed distracted or busy, with unexplained projects. They had never thought to ask what I was working on, or how I spent my time when I wasn't focused on their needs. The young man in the military uniform spoke next. His name was Carlos Martinez, and his story was even more surprising to me. He had been one of my students in the adult literacy program I'd volunteered with for over a decade. Born in Guatemala, he had come to the United States as a teenager with minimal English skills and no formal education. I had worked with him twice a week for 3 years, helping him not just learn to read and write in English, but develop the confidence to pursue his GED and eventually enlist in the Army. He was now a sergeant, he told the congregation, responsible for training new recruits and serving his adopted country with pride. But none of it would have been possible, he said, without the patient woman who had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself, who had celebrated every small victory and encouraged him through every frustration. Again, I found myself looking at my children, seeing their bewilderment at hearing about aspects of my life they had never known existed. When had I become so compartmentalized in my own existence, keeping my volunteer work and community involvement separate from my family life? When had I stopped sharing the meaningful parts of my days with the people who were supposed to be closest to me? But as more speakers took the podium, each telling stories of how I had impacted their lives in ways both large and small, I began to realize that the compartmentalization hadn't been entirely my choice. Over the years, as my children had grown busier with their own lives, our conversations had become increasingly superficial. They would call or visit, but the interactions were perfunctory, focused on immediate logistics rather than deeper sharing. When I had tried to tell them about my volunteer work or community activities, their responses had been polite but disinterested, their attention clearly elsewhere. Gradually, I had learned to keep those parts of my life to myself, not because I was secretive by nature, but because sharing them felt like imposing on people who had made it clear they had more important things to think about. My children had trained me through years of subtle dismissal and benign neglect to minimize the aspects of my identity that didn't directly relate to their needs. The woman with 2 teenagers spoke next, and her story shattered what remained of my composure. Her name was Linda Kim, and she had been struggling with severe depression following a divorce that left her with overwhelming debt and sole responsibility for her children. She had been on the verge of what she carefully termed making a permanent decision when I had somehow sensed her desperation during a chance encounter at the pharmacy. I remembered that day now, though I hadn't recognized its significance at the time. Linda had been picking up a prescription, and something about her demeanor had seemed off to me. I had struck up a conversation, learned about her situation, and impulsively invited her and her children to dinner. That dinner had led to others, had evolved into a friendship that provided Linda with the emotional support and practical assistance she needed to navigate her crisis. Linda told the congregation that I had quite literally saved her life and, by extension, her children's lives. She had gone on to rebuild her career, find stability, and create a new life for her family. Her teenagers, now thriving in school and involved in various activities, owed their current happiness to the intervention of a woman who had cared enough to reach out to a stranger in distress. As Linda spoke, I saw Sarah wipe away what appeared to be genuine tears. For the first time since I had begun this secret observation of my family, one of my children seemed to be experiencing actual emotion rather than performed grief. The story had affected her in ways the previous testimonies had not, perhaps because it involved children the same ages as some of her friends' kids, perhaps because it made the abstract concept of my community impact concrete and personal. But it was. The final speaker who delivered the most devastating blow to my children's comfortable narrative about their burdensome mother, Michael's own business partner, a man named Margaret Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, approached the podium with obvious reluctance. Robert had been Michael's partner in the consulting firm they had built together over the past 8 years. I had met him numerous times at family gatherings and business events, had always found him to be intelligent and principled, someone I was glad to see my son working with. What I had never known, and what Robert was about to reveal to the congregation, was the role I had played in their business success. During the early days of their partnership, Robert explained, they had struggled to secure the capital necessary to expand beyond small local clients. Traditional lenders had been reluctant to take risks on their unproven business model, and they had been facing the possibility of remaining a small-scale operation indefinitely. Michael had been frustrated and stressed, considering abandoning the partnership to return to corporate employment where the income was more predictable. It was then, Robert told the mourners, that Margaret Chen had quietly arranged a solution. Without telling Michael, I had mortgaged my house to provide the startup capital they needed. I had structured the loan through a third party to make it appear like a conventional business loan, allowing Michael to maintain his pride while getting the help he needed. The money had enabled them to hire additional staff, take on larger clients, and eventually build the successful firm they operated today. Robert's voice broke slightly as he explained that I had never asked for recognition or special treatment in return for my investment. I had simply wanted to see my son succeed, and I had been willing to risk my own financial security to make that possible. Michael's firm now employed 15 people and generated millions in annual revenue. None of it would have existed without my quiet intervention. The silence in the church was profound as Robert concluded his remarks. I could see Michael's face from my position in the back pew, could see the shock and confusion there as he processed this information. He had known nothing about the source of that crucial early funding, had believed it came from conventional business channels. His partner had kept my secret for 8 years, honoring my request that Michael never know his mother had been his silent benefactor. But more than the financial revelation, Robert's story highlighted something that cut to the core of my relationship with my children. I had been willing to risk everything I had to help Michael achieve his dreams, but I had done so in secret because I had known he would be uncomfortable accepting help from his mother. Even my generosity had to be hidden to protect his ego and preserve his sense of independence. When had I learned that my love was something to be concealed rather than celebrated? When had I begun to believe that my desire to help my children was an imposition rather than a gift? The answers to those questions lay in years of subtle messages from all 3 of my children that they were adults now, that they didn't need their mother's involvement in their lives, that my continued presence in their decision-making processes was infantilizing rather than supportive. As the service concluded and people began filing out of the church, I remained in my seat, overwhelmed by the cumulative impact of what I had heard. The woman being mourned by this congregation bore little resemblance to the burdensome, interfering mother my children had discussed at the viewing the previous evening. The Margaret Chen being celebrated here was a woman of substance and impact, someone who had touched dozens of lives in meaningful ways, someone whose death represented a genuine loss to her community. But perhaps most importantly, she was a woman whose own children had never bothered to learn who she really was. I watched my children accept condolences from the departing mourners, observed how they handled the stories being shared about their mother. Michael seemed particularly shaken by Robert's revelation, his professional composure cracking as he tried to process the magnitude of what he had just learned. Sarah was engaged in animated conversation with Linda Kim, asking questions about their friendship that suggested she was beginning to realize how little she had known about my daily life. Daniel remained quiet and withdrawn, but I could see him studying the faces of the people who had come to honor my memory, perhaps recognizing for the first time that his assessment of my worth was not universally shared. As the crowd thinned, I prepared to leave, but a conversation near the front of the church caught my attention. 3 women were talking with Sarah, and their words carried clearly in the now mostly empty space. The first woman, whom I recognized as Janet from my book club, was explaining to Sarah how I had organized a fundraising campaign the previous year for a local family whose house had burned down. The second woman, Maria from the community center, where I volunteered, was describing how I had tutored her daughter through high school math, enabling her to graduate and attend college on a scholarship. The third woman, Rebecca, was a newer acquaintance, but she was telling Sarah about how I had helped her elderly father navigate Medicare bureaucracy when his medication costs were threatening to bankrupt him. Each story revealed another facet of my life that my children had never known about, another way I had contributed to my community while they assumed I was simply filling empty hours with busy work. As I listened, I began to understand that my children's ignorance about my life wasn't just the result of their self-absorption. It was also the result of my own decision to protect them from feeling obligated to acknowledge or appreciate contributions they might find boring or irrelevant. I had trained them to see me as less than I was, and they had been happy to accept that diminished version because it made fewer demands on their time and attention. The irony was devastating. In my effort to be the selfless mother who never burdened her children with her own needs and interests, I had made myself invisible to them. In trying to give them the freedom to live their own lives without maternal interference, I had eliminated myself from their emotional landscape so completely that they could discuss my death as a liberation. As I finally rose to leave the church, I caught sight of a familiar figure near the altar. Pete was there, still in his worn clothes, but somehow managing to look respectful rather than out of place. He had come to Margaret Chen's funeral, this homeless man who had shown me more kindness in 3 days than my own children had shown in years. Our eyes met across the space, and he nodded slightly before slipping out through a side door. Even in this, he was thinking of me, making sure I wasn't alone in this experience, but careful not to compromise my disguise or create complications I wasn't ready to handle. The contrast between Pete's thoughtful presence and my children's calculating performance was stark and painful. A stranger had risked the discomfort of entering an unfamiliar environment just to offer silent support, while my own family was using the occasion to advance their plans for profiting from my death. Outside the church, I lingered in the parking lot, watching the final interactions between my children and the mourners. There were more stories being shared, more revelations about the life I had lived beyond their awareness. I saw Michael taking business cards from people who wanted to contribute to some kind of memorial fund they were apparently establishing in my honor. Sarah was writing down contact information for several of the women who had spoken about my volunteer work, perhaps beginning to realize there were networks and relationships she had never known existed. But it was Daniel's behavior that intrigued me most. While his siblings were networking and gathering information, he was standing apart, staring at the church building with an expression I couldn't decipher. Of my 3 children, he had always been the most sensitive, the one most likely to be affected by emotional undercurrents others might miss. Was he beginning to recognize the disconnect between the mother being mourned today and the woman he and his siblings had dismissed so casually? As the parking lot emptied and my children finally drove away, presumably to return to my house for whatever gathering they had planned for close family and friends, I found myself alone with thoughts that threatened to overwhelm me. The day had shattered every assumption I had made about my relationships with my children, my impact on my community, and my value as a human being. The woman being mourned in that church had been someone worth knowing, worth celebrating, worth missing. She had made a difference in the world through large gestures and small kindnesses, through public service and private generosity. She had been a teacher, a helper, a problem solver, a quiet force for good in the lives of dozens of people. But to her own children, she had simply been an obligation they were relieved to be free of. The realization crystallized something that had been building since I first heard Michael's words at the viewing. I didn't want to go back to being the Margaret Chen my children had known. I didn't want to resume relationships built on duty rather than genuine connection. I didn't want to pretend that their casual cruelty and calculated indifference hadn't revealed fundamental truths about who they had become. But I also didn't want to remain dead forever, didn't want to abandon the life and community connections that clearly meant something to people beyond my immediate family. The question was how to bridge the gap between the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming, how to reclaim my life without returning to the diminished version of myself I had allowed my children to create. As I walked back toward Pete's camp, my mind was already working on the next phase of my plan. If my children wanted to profit from my death, they were welcome to try. But they would do so under the watchful eye of a woman who now understood exactly what she was worth, both to herself and to the world around her. The funeral had been meant to bury Margaret Chen, but instead, it had resurrected her in ways my children could never have anticipated. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of discovering what a woman of my capabilities could accomplish when she was no longer constrained by the expectations and limitations others had placed on her. My children thought they were free of their burdensome mother. They had no idea they had just unleashed a far more formidable opponent than the compliant woman they remembered. The Margaret Chen who had died in that car accident 3 days ago had been someone who put everyone else's needs before her own, who hid her accomplishments to avoid making others uncomfortable, who accepted dismissal and neglect as the price of maintaining family peace. The Margaret Chen who walked away from that church was someone entirely different. She was a woman who had finally seen herself through the eyes of people who valued her, who had heard her life's work acknowledged and celebrated, who had discovered that her impact on the world extended far beyond the narrow confines of maternal duty. And she was about to show her children what they had really lost when they decided her death was a cause for celebration rather than sorrow. 2 weeks after my funeral, I sat in the office of Harold Brennan, the attorney who had handled Thomas's estate 8 years earlier. Harold was a kind man in his 70s who had practiced family law for over 4 decades, and his expression grew increasingly troubled as I explained my situation and showed him the documentation Pete had helped me gather. My death certificate was fraudulent, of course, since I was very much alive. But what Harold found most disturbing were the documents my children had filed claiming my estate, documents that revealed the full scope of their preparations for this moment. They had been planning for my death far longer than I had initially realized, and their scheme was more elaborate than I could have imagined. Harold adjusted his glasses and spread the papers across his mahogany desk, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision. The life insurance policy I'd mentioned hearing about was real, but it wasn't the modest coverage I remembered purchasing years ago. Someone had increased the benefit to $300,000 just 18 months ago, and the premium increases had been automatically deducted from my checking account without my conscious awareness. The house deed showed a similar pattern of manipulation. 6 months ago, someone had begun the process of transferring ownership to a family trust that listed all 3 of my children as beneficiaries. The paperwork was complex and had been filed in increments, designed to avoid triggering any automatic notifications that might have alerted me to what was happening. Most shocking of all was the power of attorney document that bore my signature, though I had no memory of signing it. The handwriting analysis Harold ordered confirmed what I suspected. It was a skilled forgery, good enough to pass casual inspection, but distinct enough from my actual signature to be legally invalid. This document had given Michael broad authority to act on my behalf in financial matters, authority he had apparently been using to restructure my assets in preparation for my anticipated death. Harold leaned back in his leather chair, removing his glasses to clean them slowly while he processed the implications of what we had discovered. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of professional experience with family disputes, but also genuine shock at the complexity of the deception. The pattern was clear, he explained. My children had been systematically preparing to claim my estate for at least 18 months, possibly longer. They had increased my life insurance coverage, initiated property transfers, forged legal documents, and positioned themselves to move quickly once I was no longer present to interfere with their plans. The speed with which they had begun executing their strategy after my supposed death wasn't the efficiency of grief-stricken children trying to manage overwhelming responsibilities. It was the culmination of a long-term plan. But Harold's most disturbing discovery came when he began investigating the circumstances of my car accident itself. The police report contained details I hadn't been aware of during my days of unconsciousness. and recovery. The brake failure that had sent my car off the bridge hadn't been the result of normal wear or mechanical failure. The brake lines had been cut, though not completely severed. The sabotage had been subtle, designed to cause failure under specific conditions, rather than immediate catastrophic loss of control. The investigation had been cursory, the kind of routine inquiry conducted when an accident appears straightforward, and no one raises questions about potential foul play. With no reason to suspect anything other than mechanical failure, and with my children expressing appropriate grief and concern, the authorities had seen no need to pursue more detailed forensic analysis. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he showed me the photographs from the accident scene. My car had gone off the bridge at exactly the spot where the guardrail was lowest, where the drop into the ravine was steep enough to make survival unlikely, but not so dramatic as to guarantee detection of any passengers who might be thrown clear. It was, he observed grimly, an almost perfect location for staging what would appear to be a fatal accident. The implications were staggering. Not only had my children been planning to profit from my death, but they may have actively arranged for that death to occur. The car accident that everyone believed had killed me might not have been an accident at all. As I sat in Harold's office, staring at evidence of what appeared to be attempted murder orchestrated by my own children, I felt something inside me break in a way that was different from the emotional devastation I had experienced at the funeral home. This wasn't just betrayal or greed, or even callous indifference to my well-being. This was a calculated attempt to end my life for financial gain. The children I had raised, the people I had loved more than my own existence, had apparently decided that I was worth more to them dead than alive. They had made a business decision about their mother's life, weighing the benefits of my death against the inconvenience of my continued existence. And they had concluded that murder was an acceptable solution to their perceived problem. Harold reached across the desk to place a comforting hand on my shoulder as I struggled to process this information. His voice was gentle but firm as he explained our options. We could contact the police immediately and present evidence of the forged documents and suspicious circumstances surrounding the accident. We could work with investigators to build a case for attempted murder and fraud. We could ensure that my children faced serious criminal charges for their actions. But he also warned me about the challenges we would face. The physical evidence of sabotage was limited, and without witnesses or clear proof of who had tampered with my car, building a criminal case would be difficult. The forged power of attorney was more promising, but proving who had created it would require extensive investigation. Most importantly, I would need to be prepared for the reality that pursuing justice might mean destroying what remained of my relationship with my children permanently. I asked Harold for time to consider my options, and he agreed to maintain complete confidentiality while I decided how to proceed. As I left his office that afternoon, I carried with me copies of all the documents he had gathered, evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond anything I had imagined when I first overheard Michael's callous words at the viewing. That evening, I sat with Pete beside his fire, sharing the revelations of my meeting with Harold. Pete listened without judgment as I described the insurance fraud, the forged documents, and the possibility that my accident had been deliberately caused. His weathered face remained calm, but I could see the anger building in his eyes as the full scope of my children's betrayal became clear. Pete had lived on the streets for 7 years, he told me, after losing his job and home during an economic downturn. In that time, he had encountered every form of human cruelty and selfishness imaginable. He had been robbed, assaulted, ignored, and dismissed by countless people who saw him as less than human. But even in his darkest experiences, he had never encountered the kind of calculated evil that my own children had apparently been planning. The irony, he observed, was that my children had been so focused on claiming my financial assets that they had completely overlooked my real value. They had seen dollar signs where they should have seen love, had calculated profit margins where they should have recognized sacrifice. They had reduced their mother to a balance sheet entry never understanding that the woman they were so eager to eliminate was worth infinitely more than any insurance payout or property transfer. But Pete's most insightful observation was about my own role in creating the conditions that had allowed their scheme to develop. By making myself invisible, by hiding my accomplishments and minimizing my contributions, by accepting their dismissive treatment without challenge, I had trained them to see me as expendable. I had been so afraid of being a burden that I had made myself appear worthless, and they had eventually taken that assessment at face value. Pete's words forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. While my children bore full responsibility for their criminal actions, I had contributed to the dynamic that made those actions seem reasonable to them. By consistently putting their needs before my own, by never demanding recognition or respect, by allowing them to take my love for granted, I had created the conditions under which they could convince themselves that my death would be a service, rather than a tragedy. The realization was painful but also liberating. If I had played a role in creating this situation, then I also had the power to change it. The question was no longer just how to seek justice for their crimes, but how to reclaim my identity as a woman of value and substance, someone whose life mattered independent of her usefulness to others. Over the following days, I began developing a plan that would address both the criminal aspects of my children's behavior and the deeper issues in our family dynamics. I would not simply return from the dead and confront them with evidence of their crimes. Instead, I would orchestrate a revelation that would force them to confront not just what they had done, but who they had become in the process. My first step was to contact several of the people who had spoken at my funeral, the community members whose stories had revealed the breadth of my impact beyond my family relationships. I reached out to Dorothy Washington, whose grandson I had helped navigate the legal system. I contacted Carlos Martinez, the veteran I had tutored through adult literacy programs. I spoke with Linda Kim, the single mother whose life I had helped save during her crisis of depression. Each of these conversations was emotional and difficult. These people had genuinely mourned my death, had grieved for someone who had made meaningful differences in their lives. Explaining that I was actually alive required me to share the circumstances that had led to my disappearance, including the discovery of my children's criminal conspiracy. But rather than being angry about the deception, these friends were outraged by what my children had attempted to do. Dorothy Washington, whose faith had carried her through decades of struggle and hardship, declared that she had never heard of such wickedness within a family. Carlos Martinez, trained in military justice and honor codes, was appalled by the betrayal of trust my children had demonstrated. Linda Kim, who understood intimately how desperate circumstances could drive people to consider terrible choices, was horrified that anyone could contemplate murdering their own mother for money. More importantly, each of these people offered to help in whatever way they could. They volunteered to serve as witnesses to my character and community contributions. They offered to provide testimony about my impact on their lives. They expressed willingness to confront my children directly about their criminal behavior if that would be helpful. Their support reminded me once again that my value as a human being extended far beyond my role as mother to 3 ungrateful children. I had built relationships and made contributions that would outlast any family drama. I had created a legacy of service and kindness that existed independently of my children's assessment of my worth. My second step was to work with Harold to develop a legal strategy that would maximize the impact of my eventual return from the dead. Rather than simply presenting evidence of their crimes to law enforcement, we would create a situation that forced my children to reveal their intentions publicly, in front of witnesses who could testify to their character and motivations. Harold's plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would arrange a meeting ostensibly for the purpose of finalizing my estate distribution, bringing together my children and several community members who had been named as beneficiaries in a revised will I had supposedly left behind. The meeting would take place in Harold's conference room, a formal setting that would lend gravity to the proceedings and ensure that everything was properly documented. My children would arrive expecting to claim their inheritance and divide, my assets according to their predetermined plan. Instead, they would find themselves confronting not just my unexpected resurrection, but also a room full of people who knew the truth about both my life and their criminal conspiracy. The revised will that Harold prepared was a masterpiece of legal strategy and poetic justice. It left the bulk of my estate to the various charitable organizations and community groups I had supported over the years, with specific bequests to individuals like Dorothy, Carlos, and Linda who had been genuinely affected by my death. My children were mentioned in the document, but their inheritances were contingent on their cooperation with a criminal investigation into the circumstances of my supposed death. The will also contained detailed descriptions of my volunteer work, community contributions, and the various ways I had impacted lives beyond my immediate family. It painted a picture of a woman whose death represented a genuine loss to her community, not the relief my children had characterized it as being. But the most devastating element of the document was a personal letter addressed to each of my children, to be read aloud during the meeting. These letters contained specific references to conversations I had overheard, actions I had witnessed, and evidence I had gathered about their criminal activities. They would serve as proof that I had been aware of their conspiracy, while also providing a final opportunity for me to express my disappointment in the people they had become. As the date for the meeting approached, I found myself experiencing a complex mixture of emotions. There was anticipation for the confrontation that would finally allow me to reveal the truth about my survival and their crimes. There was sadness for the relationships that would likely be destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. There was anger at the betrayal and attempted murder they had orchestrated. And there was a strange sense of liberation at the prospect of finally standing up for myself in a way I had never been able to do while I was trying to maintain family harmony. Pete helped me prepare for the meeting by working on my presentation and appearance. The woman who would walk into Harold's conference room would not be the diminished, apologetic mother my children remembered. She would be confident, articulate, and uncompromising in her demand for accountability. She would be dressed professionally, speak with authority, and refuse to accept dismissal or manipulation. Most importantly, she would be surrounded by people who valued and respected her, a stark contrast to the isolation my children had imposed through their years of emotional neglect and dismissal. The morning of the meeting arrived gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to match the somber nature of what was about to unfold. I arrived at Harold's office early, taking time to review the documents one final time and mentally prepare for the confrontation ahead. Dorothy Washington was the first of my community supporters to arrive, dressed in her best Sunday outfit and carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had survived far worse challenges than family betrayal. Carlos Martinez appeared precisely on time, his military bearing evident in his posture and the crisp precision of his movements. Linda Kim brought her teenage daughter, wanting the girl to witness what it looked like when someone stood up for themselves against injustice. Harold had arranged the conference room carefully, with my children's chairs positioned so they would be facing not just me, but the entire group of community members who had come to support me. The psychological impact would be immediate and powerful, forcing them to confront their actions in front of people who represented the community they had dismissed as irrelevant to their mother's worth. Michael arrived first, dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase that presumably contained documents related to his expectations for the estate distribution. His confidence was evident as he greeted Harold and took his seat, clearly anticipating a routine legal proceeding that would formalize his control over my assets. Sarah followed shortly after, her appearance polished and professional as always. She seemed slightly puzzled by the presence of the other attendees, but not yet alarmed. Her expectation, clearly, was that these people were somehow peripheral to the main business of claiming her inheritance. Daniel was the last to arrive, and his demeanor was noticeably different from his siblings. Where Michael and Sarah projected confidence and control, Daniel seemed nervous and uncertain. His eyes kept moving around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had gathered, perhaps beginning to recognize that this meeting was not going to proceed according to their expectations. Harold called the meeting to order with formal legal language, explaining that we were gathered to address the estate of Margaret Chen and to ensure that her final wishes were properly executed. He began by reading from my revised will, starting with the charitable bequests and community donations that comprised the majority of my estate. As the true scope of my community involvement and philanthropic intentions became clear, I watched my children's expressions shift from confidence to confusion to growing alarm. The estate they had expected to inherit was being distributed to organizations and individuals they had never heard of, people whose lives I had touched in ways they had never bothered to learn about. But it was when Harold began reading my personal letters that the real confrontation began. He started with Michael's letter, which detailed my knowledge of the forged power of attorney, the suspicious insurance policy increases, and the evidence suggesting that my car accident had been deliberately caused. Michael's face went pale as the specifics of his criminal activities were laid out in clinical detail. His confident posture crumbled as he realized that his supposedly dead mother had not only survived his murder attempt, but had also gathered evidence of his crimes. Sarah's letter focused on her coordination of the real estate fraud and her role in intercepting communications about awards and opportunities that had been intended for me. Her professional composure shattered as she confronted the reality that her careful planning had been observed and documented by the very person she thought she had eliminated. Daniel's letter was the most personal, expressing my disappointment, not just in his criminal actions, but in his moral cowardice in going along with his siblings' schemes despite clearly having reservations about their plans. As Harold finished reading the letters, the conference room fell into stunned silence. My children sat frozen in their chairs, their carefully constructed facade of grieving offspring completely demolished by the evidence of their attempted matricide and fraud. It was then that I stood up from my position at the back of the room, where I had been sitting quietly among the community supporters throughout the proceedings. The shock on my children's faces as they realized that their supposedly dead mother was very much alive and present was beyond anything I could have imagined. Michael was the first to find his voice, stammering questions about how I had survived, how I had learned about their activities, what I intended to do with the information I had gathered. His words came out in a rush, panic evident in every syllable as he tried to process the impossible reality of my resurrection. Sarah's response was more calculating, immediately shifting into damage control mode as she tried to minimize their actions and suggest that everything had been a misunderstanding driven by grief and confusion. Her training in public relations served her well as she attempted to spin their criminal conspiracy as a series of innocent mistakes. But Daniel's reaction was the most telling. Rather than expressing shock or attempting justification, he simply began to cry. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place of genuine remorse and recognition of the magnitude of what they had attempted to do. I allowed them to process their shock and attempt their explanations before I finally spoke. When I did, my voice was calm and steady, carrying the authority of someone who had finally claimed her full power and identity. I told them that I knew everything. I knew about the forged documents, the insurance fraud, the sabotaged brake lines, and the callous way they had discussed my death as a liberation. I knew about their plans to sell my house, claim my assets, and move on with their lives as if I had never existed. Most importantly, I knew that they had been willing to murder their own mother for money. But I also told them about the things they didn't know. I described the community of people who had genuinely mourned my death, who had shared stories of how I had impacted their lives in meaningful ways. I talked about the volunteer work they had never bothered to ask about, the relationships they had never shown interest in, the contributions I had made to the world beyond my role as their mother. I explained that their criminal actions were only part of a larger pattern of dismissal and devaluation that had characterized our relationships for years. They had trained themselves to see me as worthless by refusing to acknowledge my worth. They had made my murder seem reasonable by first making my life seem expendable. As I spoke, I watched their faces cycle through emotions ranging from shame to anger to desperate attempts at justification. Michael tried to interrupt several times, attempting to assert his authority as the eldest child and demanding to know what I wanted from them. Sarah made calculated appeals to family loyalty and maternal love, suggesting that surely I wouldn't want to destroy my own children over what she characterized as poor judgment rather than criminal intent. But it was Daniel's continued tears that affected me most deeply. Of my 3 children, he was the only one who seemed to grasp the full magnitude of what they had attempted and the depth of the betrayal it represented. His sobs suggested a level of moral awareness that his siblings appeared to lack. When I finished speaking, Dorothy Washington rose from her chair and addressed my children directly. Her voice carried the weight of 7 decades of life experience and the moral authority of someone who had faced real hardships with dignity and grace. She told them that in all her years, she had never encountered such a profound betrayal of family bonds. She described the impact their mother had made on her family's life, the way I had appeared during their darkest hour and provided help without expectation of recognition or reward. She explained that their mother was the kind of person who made the world better simply by existing in it, and that their failure to recognize her value said everything about their character and nothing about hers. Carlos Martinez spoke next, his military training evident in the precise way he articulated his disgust with their actions. He talked about honor and duty, about the codes of conduct that separated civilized people from criminals. He described the months I had spent helping him learn to read and write, the patience I had shown when he struggled, the celebration I had shared when he succeeded. He told them that their mother had been a teacher, a mentor, and a friend to someone who had nothing to offer her in return except gratitude and respect. Linda Kim's testimony was the most emotional, as she described how I had literally saved her life during her darkest period. She spoke about the dinners I had provided, the conversations that had given her hope, the practical assistance that had helped her rebuild her life. She told my children that their mother had been an angel to her family, and that their willingness to destroy such a person for money revealed a level of moral bankruptcy that she couldn't comprehend. As these testimonies continued, I watched my children's reactions carefully. Michael remained defensive and angry, clearly focused more on the legal jeopardy he was facing than on any genuine remorse for his actions. Sarah's professional mask had slipped completely, revealing a person who was calculating how to minimize damage to her reputation and social standing rather than grappling with the moral implications of attempted murder. But Daniel's response was different. He was listening to each testimony, really hearing the stories about his mother's impact on these people's lives. His tears had stopped, but his face showed genuine recognition of what they had almost destroyed. Not just in terms of my life, but in terms of the ongoing contributions I was making to my community. When the testimonies concluded, Harold presented the legal options available to us. We could pursue criminal charges for attempted murder, fraud, and forgery. We could file civil suits for damages and emotional distress. We could ensure that their crimes became public record, destroying their professional reputations and social standing. Or, he explained, we could structure a resolution that focused on accountability and restitution rather than punishment. This option would require them to admit their crimes publicly, make full financial restitution for their fraud, and submit to ongoing oversight of their relationship with me to ensure that no further harm was attempted. I had given considerable thought to this choice in the days leading up to the meeting. While my anger and sense of betrayal certainly supported pursuing maximum criminal penalties, I also recognized that destroying my children completely would not restore what had been lost or heal what had been broken. Instead, I proposed a different kind of justice. Michael would surrender the forged power of attorney and make full restitution for any funds he had misappropriated. Sarah would transfer back all property deeds and pay penalties for the fraudulent real estate transactions. Daniel would take responsibility for the insurance fraud and work with investigators to ensure that all fraudulent claims were reversed. More importantly, all three would be required to participate in family counseling designed to address the underlying dynamics that had made their criminal behavior seem acceptable to them. They would need to confront not just their actions, but their attitudes, not just their crimes, but their character. The community oversight component of my proposal was perhaps the most significant element. My children would be required to volunteer with the same organizations I had supported, working directly with the people whose lives I had touched. They would see firsthand the impact their mother had made beyond their family relationships. They would understand through direct experience why my death had been mourned by so many people. As I outlined these terms, I watched my children process what I was offering them. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was an opportunity for redemption that most people who attempt murder never receive. It was a chance to rebuild their relationships with me on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect, rather than manipulation and exploitation. Michael's response was immediate and predictable. He rejected my proposal outright, insisting that he had done nothing wrong and that any mistakes had been the result of grief and confusion rather than criminal intent. He threatened to fight any legal action I might take, confident that his resources and connections would allow him to escape serious consequences. Sarah's response was more measured but equally self-serving. She acknowledged that mistakes had been made, but suggested that my terms were unnecessarily harsh, given the family relationships involved. She proposed alternative arrangements that would minimize her public exposure and financial liability while still appearing to accept responsibility. But Daniel's response surprised everyone in the room. He stood up slowly, walked around the conference table, and knelt beside my chair. Through tears that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul, he told me that he was sorry. Not just for the criminal conspiracy, but for the years of dismissal and devaluation that had preceded it. He admitted that they had lost sight of who I was as a person, that they had reduced me to a collection of obligations and inconveniences rather than recognizing me as a woman of substance and value. He accepted my terms unconditionally, volunteering to begin his community service immediately and to cooperate fully with any investigation into their activities. More importantly, he asked if there was any possibility that we could rebuild our relationship, that he could learn to see and appreciate the person his mother really was, rather than the diminished version he had constructed in his mind. Daniel's genuine remorse and willingness to accept accountability created a stark contrast to his siblings' continued defensiveness and self-justification. It also presented me with a choice I hadn't fully anticipated. Was redemption possible for children who had attempted to murder their mother? Could genuine change occur in people who had demonstrated such profound moral bankruptcy? The answer, I realized, would depend not on my willingness to forgive, but on their willingness to transform themselves into people worthy of forgiveness. Michael and Sarah's refusal to accept responsibility or acknowledge the gravity of their actions made that transformation impossible for them. They had revealed themselves to be people whose moral development had been permanently stunted, who were incapable of growth or genuine remorse. But Daniel's response suggested the possibility of a different outcome. His tears and apologies might be genuine. His willingness to accept consequences might reflect real recognition of wrongdoing. His request for a chance to rebuild our relationship might come from a place of authentic desire for connection rather than manipulation. In the end, I decided to give Daniel the opportunity to prove that his remorse was real while pursuing full legal action against Michael and Sarah. Justice required that all three face consequences for their crimes, but mercy allowed for the possibility that one of them might be capable of genuine change. The criminal investigations that followed revealed the full scope of their conspiracy and led to convictions for all three of my children. Michael received the longest sentence due to his leadership role in the murder plot, and his continued refusal to cooperate with authorities. Sarah's public relations skills couldn't save her from fraud convictions that destroyed her professional reputation and social standing. But Daniel's cooperation with investigators and genuine remorse earned him a more lenient sentence that included extensive community service and mandatory psychological counseling. More importantly, it earned him the chance to gradually rebuild a relationship with the mother he had nearly murdered. The process was slow and often painful. Trust, once broken, so completely could not be easily restored. But through months of family therapy, community service, and honest conversation, Daniel began to understand not just what he had done, but why he had been capable of doing it. He learned about the Margaret Chen who existed beyond their family, relationships, the woman who had tutored struggling students and helped families in crisis and organized community fundraisers. He discovered the depth of impact his mother had made on dozens of lives, the legacy of service and kindness that extended far beyond maternal duty. Most importantly, he began to see me as a complete person rather than a collection of obligations. He learned to appreciate my intelligence, my compassion, my strength, and my independence. He discovered that his mother was someone worth knowing, worth respecting, worth loving, not because she was his mother, but because she was a remarkable human being. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. Years of damaged relationship, dynamics couldn't be healed overnight. But it was genuine, and it was enough to build upon. As for me, the experience of dying and being reborn had taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. I discovered that my value as a human being wasn't dependent on my children's recognition or appreciation. I learned that I had built a life of meaning and impact that existed independently of my family relationships. Most importantly, I realized that the woman who had been so afraid of being a burden had actually been a gift to everyone whose life she had touched. The Margaret Chen who emerged from that ravine wasn't just alive, she was fully awakened to her own worth and potential. Pete, who had been the catalyst for this transformation, became one of my closest friends. I helped him find stable housing and employment, and he continued to provide the kind of honest perspective that only someone who has lost everything can offer. Our friendship was built on mutual respect and genuine care, a stark contrast to the transactional relationships I had maintained with my children for so many years. The house that my children had planned to sell became a meeting place for the various community organizations I supported. The insurance money they had tried to claim funded scholarships for students like Carlos Martinez who needed help achieving their educational goals. The estate they had tried to steal became a resource for helping people like Linda Kim navigate life crises with support and dignity. In the end, their attempt to profit from my death had resulted in even greater benefit to the community they had tried to rob. Their plan to eliminate a woman they saw as worthless had instead revealed her true value to everyone who mattered. 2 years later, as I sat in the garden behind my house, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this place of peace and purpose. Daniel was working in the community garden we had established together, his weekly volunteer commitment having evolved into genuine passion for helping others. He had learned to see service not as obligation, but as privilege, not as burden, but as blessing. Michael and Sarah had served their sentences and moved to different cities, cutting off contact with me entirely. Their choice to remain unrepentant and unchanging was painful, but no longer devastating. I had learned that love didn't require reciprocation to be valid, that my worth as a mother wasn't dependent on my children's ability to recognize it. The woman who had died in that car accident 3 years ago had been someone who defined herself entirely through her relationships with others, who measured her value by her usefulness to people who took her for granted. The woman who survived was someone who knew her own worth, who built relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, who used her gifts to benefit people who appreciated rather than exploited them. Margaret Chen had finally learned to live for herself, and in doing so, had discovered that she had far more to offer the world than she had ever imagined. Her death had been the beginning of her real life, and her resurrection had been the birth of her true self. The greatest irony was that my children's attempt to eliminate what they saw as a burden had actually freed me to become the woman I was always meant to be. In trying to kill their mother, they had inadvertently given birth to someone far more powerful, purposeful, and fulfilled than the person they remembered. It was, I realized, the most valuable gift they had ever given me, even though they had never intended it as a gift at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.